Welcome back to another Master Game Analysis video. We are once again going to be analyzing the Master, John Bartholomew, International Master level. Not a bad level of chess to be at. And let's see if we can learn from him by trying to predict his moves and then by actually hearing from him directly as to what he was thinking when he played those moves. So let's waste no time here at all. His opponent, I'm not sure if she is actually a master, but her rating on chess.com is a very hefty, 22 or 2300, so definitely someone that knows how to play high quality chess. With that in mind, let's see. We can't predict the first move, so let's see what John Bartholomew goes for, and he goes for d4, a queen's pawn opening. We have knight f6 here. There's many good moves. Let's see what's played. Okay, knight f3, no problem. e6 is played here. I think c4 is probably the most natural, and it's played. We have here bishop. What's this? Bishop b4 check, and I think we've transposed here almost into a Nimzo-Indian, perhaps. Now, I suppose what would I do here is John Bartholomew, not knowing the theory. I mean, there's probably several, very, very normal moves, and I think that's the most normal of them. But this is an alternative move, also, completely understandable. So, okay, after the capture, how would I like to take here? Probably with the queen. And that's how John Bartholomew does it agree. He agrees. I think, it develops the queen to a safe square. Queen still has lots of potential, and the knight can come to its most natural square here as well. So black's castled. What would I do here as John Bartholomew? Well, probably I would actually develop the knight. The only other consideration would be either e3 or e4. Of e3 and e4, I mean, e4 doesn't really make a lot of sense because the knight would simply take it with a tempo on our queen. In fact, if e3, we also fall prey to the same tempo. So I think I'd start with knight c3. John Bartholomew does the same thing. Now we have Alyssa, this very strong player, looking as though they're going to fianchetto this bishop. You never know, maybe it's going to come to a6 as well, supported by the knight. But in the meantime, what are we going to do? I would say e3 is the most natural. e4, however, is played, and that makes a lot of sense given that it is supported by our knight. And hey, why not grab more of the center if we can? We're going to be able to support the center further with bishop d3, castle, put rooks in the center. It's looking like a really comfortable position for white, and I suppose there's no real reason to just go for something more passive, giving this really nice diagonal for the bishop to be on, when what we could do is actually occupy that center in the John Bartholomew way, so that this bishop, although putting pressure on a pawn, is also possibly going to find itself on a diagonal that might close up at some point. And in the meantime, we have a very comfortable position regardless. Okay, so then instead of fianchettoing the bishop immediately, Alyssa actually plays through to the center. Gives us an opportunity to exchange our c pawn, which is a flank pawn, a wing pawn, to exchange that for one of these central pawns, the d pawn. And I would imagine he doesn't want to give the queen up, or I should say she doesn't want to give the queen up. And also doesn't want to give the knight up because both of them would be taken by this pawn. So if we take, Alyssa's going to probably have to take back with this other pawn. At which point, if we want, we could take again. But then there could be knight takes, queen takes. And what have we really gained? All we've really gained there is an isolated pawn, which he controls the square in front of the isolated pawn. So I don't think that's necessarily going to favor us, but maybe taking once and then after he takes back, instead of taking a second time, we could possibly push this pawn forward, winning a tempo on this knight. Now that knight would be able to jump here, but we could take it from there if we wanted. And after he recaptures, our other knight can actually jump here, where it's supported by the queen, so can't be captured by his queen, but puts some pressure on this pawn. Now he can then defend that pawn in a variety of ways, and we can't take it because we're still very far from castling. So if we were to play that way and the knight jumps down, maybe we're first better off to just continue developing our bishop. But then, that might be completely fine, in fact. So maybe take, he takes, push, he comes here, we develop the bishop. If he wants to take this, well, we can either take like this or like this, but we're ready to castle. So really, do we take here is a big question. I'm finding it hard to really come up with an answer. I don't think we're afraid of him capturing us because we simply take back with the bishop. We would like to castle, that's for sure. If we develop our bishop to either of these squares, he may then take, and then we're forced to use another tempo to recapture. That's not the end of the world, but at the same time, all of that could be avoided by simply taking. So let's say take, he takes, and push. I think that would be a reasonable way to play. I don't know if JB is going to do that, John Bartholomew. Let's keep calculating. After knight e4, we got bishop e3. Let's say he does take the knight and just tries to somewhat simplify things. If we want to keep our pawn structure intact, well, let's take with the queen. But it's kind of an awkward square for our queen, I think. Although it's an open file and we can put pressure on this pawn, ultimately the pawn's going to land on c5, and I'm just not so sure that our pieces really end up in the best positions there if he's given a chance to take this knight. Maybe if we could put a rook on c1 first of all, then if he takes again, we take back, we haven't lost any tempos. And if he does nothing, then we can take, he takes, we push, he comes here, we bring the bishop here, and if he takes here, we can take with the rook if we want. I'm really not sure. I really don't know what to do here. So let's see what JB does, and then we're going to cut over and we're going to see what JB thought about this position. So here's what he played. He actually does take. And I'm going to now cut the video over, and let's hear from John Bartholomew about how he reasoned that position through.
Yep, black strikes back with d5. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and here too, I'm debating if I should keep the tension or maybe take once and then play e5 a la an exchange queen's gambit. Exchange queen's gambit declined. Kind of leaning towards that option. Yeah, let's do that. Let's take once and push. Strong pawn chain. I suspect black will go here. But I can play queen e3. I could think about taking and going knight g5. Just kind of depends how I want to handle it.
Yeah, so kind of interestingly there, JB didn't spend anywhere near as long as I did toing and froing about all those potential different moves. He ultimately, went for the capture and basically said, let's see what my opponent does in response. He's happy enough that after the capture he can push e5. Even though the knight can come down here, he knows he's got options. Whether it's to take the knight, have this pawn recapture, and then jump the knight out here, as I had mentioned, or whether it's something else like, after takes, pushing, knight e4, the queen's attacked. So if we don't take, maybe it's just moving the queen up here. Whatever it is, he's just going to see what the opponent does. So, all right, we're happy enough either way. It's not necessarily the biggest deal in the world to spend 6 minutes on, so let's move on and see what happens. Alyssa takes the pawn back, so let's play the intended advance of e5, and let's see what happens. So the knight does jump down, so now we can think more concretely about what we want to do. Now, we certainly, considering the capture first, the pawn is likely to recapture. We can't obviously attack that with our bishop. However, with the pawn over here, he is also attacking our knight. So we may want to put this knight up here where it attacks the pawn immediately. And I'm realizing I made a mistake in my earlier calculation when I was drawing arrows and visualizing this. Because in that position, I thought that he would be able to defend his pawn by playing something like rook e8. And I was getting nervous about how the king was still in the center of the board. But in fact, with our pawn here on e5, our king's still relatively safe and might well have time to develop the bishop and castle safely. So let's calculate. After takes, and knight g5, if he immediately attacks our knight in some way or other, we jump back, we win the pawn, and basically everything's hunky-dory, because even if he takes this pawn, we take the pawn back. There's no danger of him taking the queen because we have that queen defended twice. So after takes, and this, if he really wants to defend the pawn, kind of has to be with the bishop, or maybe with the other pawn. If he uses this pawn, we can take if we want. Once again, this pawn will be hanging. So I think the way that he would have to do it is actually to defend with the bishop. And at that point, what have we? Ooh, what have we? We could attack the bishop. We could attack the bishop, which he could defend. And then we could develop our own bishop out to a nice active square and just look to castle. So I think that looks fine. Double check. So take, jump our knight out here. He defends by playing bishop f5. And then even a move like queen e3 in that position, not necessarily attacking the bishop, but just saying we're going to capture this pawn. If he defends the pawn, well, he can't because the bishop's in the way. So I actually think that's good, and I think I would actually take this knight. But no, John Bartholomew does not do that. He comes up with a move that strikes me as kind of odd and premature in the sense that he's moved the queen for a second time. He's put it into the center of the board, kind of. He's not necessarily threatening anything immediately. Well, I guess what he's threatening is to take the knight and then take the pawn behind it. So whereas what I was thinking was take, and then attack the pawn, he's saying, let's not take yet. Let's come in with an immediate threat of take and then immediately taking the pawn. If he takes this knight, or if she takes the knight, we can always take back. We've got a nice pawn chain here regardless. And we're just developing in a nice way. We'll see what we do with this bishop, and we do have time to muck around. Let's see if he actually expresses these thoughts or elaborates on them a little bit more.
Play knight g5, bishop e7. My knight looks a little weird on that square, so leaning towards this queen e3 move. Maybe queen f4 is also a consideration if I want to stop bishop f5. Bit of a close call there. I think both are decent. Maybe black will play f5, I'm not sure. But I kind of like the queen f4 move. So let's go with that. Pre-move the obvious capture.
There you go. Very interesting. One of the things I've noticed when I'm considering bishop moves is I often forget that bishops move in both diagonals. If he wants to defend the knight, or even after take, and we attack the pawn, he doesn't have to come from this angle. He could also come from this angle, and that's more natural in a way, because it leaves open the possibility of playing f5 in the future, and because he's already played b6, so why not make use of this long diagonal? So it sort of does make more sense in this line to calculate with bishop b7, which is one thing that John Bartholomew did. The other thing he sort of realized was, as mentioned, moving the queen out here does actually threaten to win the pawn directly. And of the two squares, the difference being that from f4, we just inhibit the possibility. We inhibit the possibility of bishop f5 because we would simply capture the bishop. So it's actually a very multi-purpose move. At first, I didn't really see the point. It seemed a bit bizarre. But it actually makes a lot of sense because we're threatening to win a pawn. We are inhibiting potentially a more natural development square of the bishop, or a potential option for the bishop at any rate. And we're just not afraid of this because we have a nice pawn chain regardless. So, okay, we've learned a lot so far. Bishop f4. Let's see how the game progresses now. Takes, so we're going to obviously take back. And now c6. All right, seems passive, and it seems like this is the most natural square for our bishop. So, I mean, the first instinct is to continue development with bishop d3, get it pointing towards his king, and then probably castle. I don't think there's anything else immediately hanging, so I think that's what I would play. And yep, John Bartholomew, the international master of acclaim, agrees. And we have h6 on the board. Okay, so quite slow. And what I mean by slow is look at all the pawn moves that black has made. And meanwhile, look at all their pieces that are on the back rank. None of these pieces are actually operating in the game. I mean, some of them are long-range pieces, but they're all sitting at home on the back rank. Meanwhile, we got 3 pieces out in the board. So Yes, black is castled, but if we want to, we can castle right now, and I think that would probably make a lot of sense. Might also make sense to play something like h4, just to prevent g5. Now, would g5 be a move that he would actually want to play, opening up his king a lot? I feel like this is the kind of move where maybe I'm considering it because it comes with the tempo against the queen, but maybe an international master or a grand master might not even give this move 2 seconds notice because of how much it weakens their own king, and therefore wouldn't even give h4 any notice to prevent this idea because they don't think it's worth preventing. But I wonder, because if we calculate, g5 does hit the queen, no matter how you look at it. That queen can't really come anywhere forward, and going to the side isn't really feasible either unless you want to drop down to g3, and maybe then h4 is even better. So maybe we're not afraid of that because g5 we just go queen g3. And yes, the black king is very open. We are coming in very shortly thereafter with other moves. I mean, he could follow up with an immediate g4 attacking our knight. But our knight there has squares. It can come here, for instance. And, we can still think about playing moves like h3, look to take that pawn, open up this. I don't know if we need to be afraid of it enough to actually play h4 immediately. Now, if we castle, I think this is the most threatening move. Moves like this just give us plenty of time and we don't really need to worry, like castling's fine. We just really do need to look, I think, at g5. And after queen g3, if g4, there is, like we say, knight h4, and things are okay. It might be nice just to decline castling for one move and to actually play h4 to prevent this whole idea. Just to prevent the whole idea. We can still castle if we want. So I think I actually would play either h4 or castles. But of the two, I've got to say, I think I'd go for h4. John Bartholomew castles. Let's see if he can shed a bit more light for us on that thought process from the level of an international master.
Black plays c6. Okay, so this seems a little bit passive. So let's play this without any hesitation. Maybe I'm starting to get some Greek gift ideas with this and this. Not sure it's working, but black plays h6 nonetheless. All right. So just thinking, if I castle, how much do I care about this bishop a6 operation? I don't know if it's worth thinking about much for me because I think my opponent will play this anyways. Don't think I really want to castle queenside. My king looks a little open there, so yeah, let's castle short. We're both playing.
All right, so interestingly, he didn't actually give any explicit thought to the idea of h4. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious what maybe the computer would have to say about the move h4 in that position. Is there something really bad with that idea? Instead of castles, what if instead we had played h4? I would just like to know. Let's see. It's not one of the first three moves, but if played, h4, yeah, it's not too bad. It's, the evaluation is maybe a little bit less, but practically speaking, it probably doesn't make much of a difference. Castles is objectively better, but it's not like this makes it, minus 1.5 or anything. It's still plus 0.11. So interesting. Maybe that's just my style. Regardless, let's get back to the game as played. And that was castles and then bishop h6. Now, do we want to take here and help him to develop? I would say probably not. Do we want to actually maintain this bishop, even giving up an exchange to do so? I'd also say probably not. So I think a natural move here would just be rook to d1. I think rook to d1 here is a very natural move. Almost too natural not to do. Maybe you could consider rook f to d1, but I think this rook may come in handy where it is in the future. But, there's a case to be made for either. Probably both could be played. But I think I would go rook a d1 But no, John Bartholomew actually retreats the queen from the threat of g5 in future, just reinforcing the bishop and allowing himself to postpone the idea of where he wants to put the rooks. Again, I would love to get a bit more of an elaboration from the master himself on how he came to this position. Let's have a look.
Yeah, I think this is a good move, bishop a6. Now, I may not want to initiate the trade. That's one thing I'm thinking. So if I take, black may be able to maneuver this knight in. Long term, I do think I want my pawn up here, though. So I wonder if I drop my queen back, let's say, and we get a trade, if I can move the knight and go for f4, f5. Yeah, let's drop the queen back. I know that looks a little inconsistent, but I like the idea of initiating this trade and having my queen positioned kind of as a two-way piece towards the a6 square, towards h7.
So very interesting there that what the international master, John Bartholomew, had in mind was not just, let's develop a piece again. And again, I don't think those moves were necessarily going to be bad. We could check with the computer, but for the sake of staying within the mind of a master rather than the mind of a computer, let's understand what he did. He's looking in the long term, and in the long term, he's thinking this f pawn should be up next to its buddy and maybe even pushing through at some point. That ain't ever going to happen as long as we have a knight and a queen here. So I kind of want to move these guys out of the way. So in that sense, why don't I defend with the queen? Later on, I can move the knight. And then with my rook where it is, it'll be able to support this pawn pushing forward. So this idea is actually connected with a long-term plan. Whereas these ideas of mine weren't really connected with a long-term plan. And after takes and takes, it might be that the queen ends up possibly in an awkward scenario. Of course, it could always jump back at that point in time. But why not just drop it back now if we already have this long-term idea? So we can work towards long-term goals in the short term. Even though they're long-term goals, you can do something about them right now. Very interesting. So queen d2 was played. After the capture, obviously we capture back, and then knight d7. So what now? Well, we've already had a clue about what the long-term plan and the position was, possibly to move the knight and play these pawns forward, but these plans can often change, and they're long-term by nature, which means we may not be able to do those things just yet. Now, this move even comes to mind for me. Even though he can simply take the pawn, it does open up this square for our knight. Now, at the moment, his knight simply captures back, and then we take back, and we've ruined our whole pawn structure. So I don't think this works yet. But all that said, it sort of brings to light the notion of maybe putting a rook onto e1 to support this push in future, so that after he takes back, we can take with our rook. And then we kind of are, thinking of doubling our rooks on that file and putting a knight here. And even if he takes back, we take back and we kind of own the e file with our rooks. We can put a queen on there as well and claim that that's a long-term advantage, minimal but existent. So maybe a move like rook f to e1. And I know, we were just talking about keeping the rook on f1 and advancing the other pawn. But what's this other rook going to do? I mean, it is defending a2. Maybe it wants to go onto a semi-open file or to come and defend this backwards pawn in future. So I do think this rook has other roles. And if we are going to move toward this move instead, maybe rook fe1 makes some sense. Now, let's think of some alternatives here. He's maybe thinking of playing a move like this, but even if he takes there, we take back. And if he pushes our queen out of the way, we can move. We don't really need to worry about those things as of yet. If we want to reroute the knight and continue on with, f4, and then maybe even bringing the knight back at some point, or f4, f5. So that's a possibility, just bringing this knight back and preparing to play f4. All those moves in a way sort of seem a little slow. We could think of moves like this. Keep in mind, there's no sensible checks at the moment. nor is there any sensible capture. So, we could threaten things. We could maybe play a move like c4, but really it comes with no threat at all. Maybe you could say we're threatening to give him an isolated pawn and get rid of one of our backwards pawns. But if he just takes, we take back, and I don't see what we've gained except putting our queen on a slightly less impressive square. He can just always protect that pawn if he wants. So I think these moves are probably my main candidates, and probably of the two, actually, knight d2 looks fine. We can follow up with f4 without much issue. We can always then put the knight back if we want. And it's basically a harmless move. Let's see what John Bartholomew does, and then we'll drop back in and see his thoughts about the move as well. He actually plays the other rook, the rook that I thought had several other jobs, to e1. Now, I kind of understand the e1 square, but I don't really understand why he chose this rook, or why he didn't continue with his long-term plan of moving the knight away and pushing the pawn. So let's see if we can get a little bit more info on that one, eh?
Maybe I start with rook ae1. And then knight d2 or knight d2 right away. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, let's play rook ae1. So I'm using this rook because I think this rook could be useful with the f-pawn push at some point in the future. So after I move this knight. And why am I playing on this wing? This is where I have the majority. I don't think I'm better on this side of the board because black has a majority here. 4 pawns versus 3. This pawn's backward too. I don't think it's that problematic for me, but don't be surprised if you see both players trying to enforce their play on these respective wings.
It's a very interesting once again. Once again, a couple of sort of things to note there. One was that he was considering knight d2 100%, and his words were, "I'm not sure," when considering whether to start with rook e1 or knight d2. He said, "I'm not sure." But he didn't then spend a million hours on it. He just chose one and went with it. And the reason he went with this, which I didn't consider at all, was sort of splitting the board into different halves or different areas and realizing he wants to concentrate his forces on this side of the board where he's better. Yes, this is an isolated pawn and this is a backwards pawn, but he doesn't want to sit back and just passively defend them. He wants to actually concentrate his forces here. He wants to preserve the possibility of pushing this pawn supported by the f-rook. And he's kind of going all in a way. He's saying, look, this is my plan. I've already moved my queen out of the way. I'm going to move my knight. I'm not doing it yet, but I will. I'm going to push this pawn forward, and I want everything to be playing on this side of the board where I'm better. Because if everything is going in the direction where I'm better, well, you need to defend against that, is I suppose what he's saying. So let's see how that plays out. He played rook e1, and Alyssa plays rook e8. So now what are we going to do? I mean, I suppose the natural continuation is knight d2, which he plays. And there's now queen e7. And I suppose now, again, the natural continuation would be f4. And I don't see why not. And it is played. All right, so queen a3. Now we see maybe what I was afraid of earlier, and that is, here's an isolated pawn. It can't be defended by just, pushing it forward somehow. There's no other pawn to defend it. If we want to defend that pawn, we got to do it with a piece. And there's various ways we could. We could drop a queen back. We could bring a rook over. Maybe we could have something tactical like this. And after he takes, can we jump our knight away with a discovered attack against the queen so that he doesn't have time to capture our knight? And after the queen moves, we jump our knight up here and just establish it on a strong square where it has a bit of a grip on his position. Maybe all those things are somewhat possible. But what is John Bartholomew, the master, going to do? Well, I don't know. Maybe he comes here. Let's go with the pawn for no good reason. And then attacks from there, but that doesn't seem as promising as, just playing a move like this immediately. That seems more promising to me. If you're going to let this pawn go, at least let it go in a way where you can get your knight into a beautiful square as a consequence. What else can we do though? Do we want to just drop the queen back here and say, well, yes, you do have a queen on my side of the board, but it's not doing much? Maybe. Or maybe we want to say, look, I'm not going to worry about this pawn. I'm going to worry about this side of the board where I have all my pieces and I'm better. How to proceed, though, isn't very clear. I mean, we could maybe just go ahead with f5, giving up on a2, and then just blasting through with either f6 or e6. So let's try and calculate those things. f5, queen takes a2. Let's start first with f6. What are we really doing on f6? Well, we're threatening to take, and king has to take back, and then the king side's quite open. So I suppose that's what we're sort of threatening. If he takes here, well, then we can take with our pawn, but he takes the rook, we take back, and alternatively, if we take, he takes, we've lost an exchange. I don't see the point. So if we do play this and queen takes a2, I think the follow-up would probably be e6. And after e6, perhaps the most natural move would be knight f6. Would also be completely possible for the pawn to capture. But then we recapture again, and then knight e6. Then we could maybe play a move like this. And that kind of looks good to me. Even if he takes our knight, we can take a knight. But then he takes here with check. So I don't know. I really don't know. And this is tough. Now I'm going to pause the video and give myself a bit of time to think. So you don't have to watch me think. So I'm going to give a bit of myself a bit of time, and then I'll let you know my thoughts. Once I've had my thoughts and gathered them, we'll hear from John Bartholomew again. See you in a moment. All right, one thought I've had is that I don't think I particularly like this move. As I was saying before, maybe if he takes, we can discover an attack against the queen. And when the queen moves back somewhere, we can establish a strong knight here somewhere. The reason I think I don't like that necessarily anymore is after he takes the pawn, and we come in with the discovered attack, he could actually take the rook. And then after we take the queen, he takes the knight, and he's won a pawn, a knight, and a rook for his queen. Queen and pawn, to be fair. But in this position, all we've got is a queen and a rook. He's got an outside pass pawn, and he's got two rooks and a knight. I kind of feel like this would be difficult for white. I'm not sure, but I do feel it would be difficult for us here. And for that reason, I don't think I really want to consider this variation anymore of playing rook e2 and sacking the pawn that way. So I'll have a bit more of a think, and I'll see you shortly. Now, I haven't calculated it at all to the end. I don't think I'm capable of that at the moment. But I think I'm actually willing to sacrifice this pawn for the sake of playing f5 and f6, which is what I'd have a chance to do. If f5 and he takes on a2, then f6 is immediately played. And the reason I do actually like that is because if he takes here, well, as we mentioned, if he doesn't take, I take, and that sort of opens him up on the side of the board where all my pieces already kind of are. And if he does take, well, that also opens up his king. And I can either lift my rook and try and get my rook into the game, or I can give this check immediately, even though he starts to run. I kind of get the sense that even my queen can come here, and I might get this one back, or, I might end up having pressure on this. I just feel like giving this pawn away in this manner is a way to open up his king on the side of the board where all the pieces are. And although I can't quite comprehend the complexity of all of that, I think the compensation of opening up his king on the side of the board where my pieces are may well be worth the cost of giving up an a2 pawn. So let's see what John Bartholomew has to say about all of this, if he says anything about this at all.
The e6 square, I think knight d2 is consistent here. Knight d2 followed by f4. e5 is a knight here. Now, I don't think this is really a threat because I could trap the queen. So if I just continue full steam ahead here, what is going to happen? Maybe that c5 move? But black's king is looking awfully lonely here coming up. Just seeing if I'm overlooking any tactic after f5. I'm not really seeing it. Not a whole lot of other moves I would consider here, so let's go ahead and play it.
Well, that was insightful, to say the least. Basically what he said was he's not concerned about queen takes a2 because it actually loses the queen. After you do a move like this, where does the queen go? Can't retreat along the diagonals because they're both taken by our knight. Can't stay on the A file because it's taken by our rook. If he comes to the B file, we can attack him again with a rook, and he's actually out of squares, and he's going to have to give the queen up for a rook. I completely overlooked that. But in saying that, he did agree that his king starts looking very lonely, and, there's not really anything else that he wants to try, so process of elimination, he's going to give this a go. But really interesting to note, look at his queen here all alone. That's nothing to be afraid of. A queen all alone against my army. Keep that in mind. But sometimes you can be right for the wrong reasons, and I think that's what happened here for me. In any case, let's continue the game and see what happens next. Is that actually what happened? No. So after f5, yeah, it looks like Alyssa actually did take the pawn. And John Bartholomew went and trapped the queen. She took her rook. He took back. Now she's played a5. Now this is an interesting moment because clearly here white's a lot better. White's just won a lot of material. So although she's a strong player, I should be able to even win this game myself from here. Should. Not saying I always would, but should be able to win this game from here. Now she's going to try and rush these pawns and put me under all sorts of pressure. I got to try and survive that pressure here and possibly even thrive. So how am I going to do that? Well, good question. Very good question. And I think there's probably several different answers to the question. One option might be to play c4 immediately and just try and trade things off. If you take, I take back with my knight. I'm not at all afraid of that. Even if you play something like this, well, then I can take this. And life's completely fine. So I don't think you can take here, but at the same time, I'm threatening to take. Yes, you have two passed pawns. I can give up a knight for one of them at some point if I want. I can make life difficult in that sense. Anything else I can do? I can immediately play e6 if I want. You take, I take, you take. And then I can even come here, attacking the rook. And where does that rook go? It has to come here if it wants to defend the knight. And once he defends the knight, I can bring my rook across again and put pressure on this and bring these guys to the fore and try and get some trades happening. But this is a dangerous scenario. So what exactly will I do? Very fair question. I think knight b3 also makes sense just to halt this pawn. If that pawn moves, we take that pawn off the board. If this pawn moves, however, in relation to knight b3, if he plays a4, what then? What then? Well, then I suppose, again, maybe we can play this move. Because if he takes here, we take, he takes, we come here. It's just, again, not easy, believe it or not. Chess is just never easy, but what to do? What to do? Maybe even knight b1 and just plant the knight on a3 and say, how do you get this pawn passed if I'm sitting on a3? You'd have to use the other pawn, but if you bring the other pawn into the game, eventually I'm just going to take it. Then if you take back, I'm going to come here. We might get a trade of rooks. I'm going to put my other knight in front. So I think I'd be willing to play a move like knight b1 even. Let's see what John Bartholomew does. He actually goes with c4. It does make sense. And that's where Alyssa resigned. Let's just see John's thoughts on this last move of the game, and we'll close the video out there once we get a learning point from that. So see you very shortly.
These situations can be difficult for black because it's hard for black to know if I'm going to play e6 or f6, and she has to prepare for both possibilities, right? So constantly black has to keep in mind which one I may go for. This one's 2 points of contact, but this one is closer to the king, the f6 move. Ooh, yeah, and unless I'm missing something, this is just going to lose the queen. Rook a1, queen b2, rook b1. Just pausing here because obviously if I think this is going to lose the queen for black, then I can afford to spend 30 extra seconds on this move. I'm going to be in a winning position. Yeah, because black doesn't have the c4 square available. So rook a1, there's only queen b2 as a safe move. I mean, there is knight takes e5 somewhere, but I don't see how that's going to change things. So rook a1, queen b2, rook f to b1, also guards the b5 square, any retreats that black is planning along the b file. Yeah, it's a tough blunder because I don't see any way black can really complicate things. So it's just going to be some material. I've mentioned this before, but sometimes if you blunder, and it's apparent after you blunder to both you and your opponent that you're going to be losing material, you can force your opponent to spend time taking that material and thereby complicate the game. So sometimes there's some ability to tweak around the margins. But here I'm not seeing that. Like knight takes e5 even just doesn't really help. So yeah, there goes the queen. Now, black does have some pawns over here that I have to respect. So at this point, I'm probably going to think about playing a little more on the queen side. That's for sure. I can think about this f6 move too. Like f6 takes queen f5, but the a pawn is annoying. We have to keep that in mind. I'm thinking maybe c4 here is a good move. c4, and again, just try to get my knight up or maybe create an isolated pawn on d5. Let's go for it. Still think about some opportunities with these pawns, like maybe f6 somewhere, especially if this knight leaves the d7 square, but not rushing it. Immediate threat here, if I get a spare move, that's always something useful to think about, is taking on d5 and playing queen b5, hitting the knight on d7 and the pawn on d5.
Yeah, well, there you have it. Unforced error there by Alyssa, and by which she lost the game. But John Bartholomew was very much, it's not just that it was an unforced error and, she just gave the game away. When she took this pawn, John Bartholomew was aware of enough of the fact to actually play rook a1 and rook b2. Because as I was saying in my calculations, I was just looking at this move next. And I would have missed the chance. Alyssa would have stayed in the game, probably beaten me later down the line and justified her having a higher rating than me. But John Bartholomew, being the international master that he is, he's not going to miss an opportunity to trap someone's queen. And so that was a nice game. There was quite a lot of things there that he did maybe differently than I would have done, or just did in very sensible ways. The first one was, take the center. Why not? Why not take the center? The other was he was very, good with his time use, which is not always the case with John Bartholomew, but he really was good. He didn't spend forever. He thought, this is good enough. Let's see what happens. He pushed the pawn. And here, a very nice move, I thought. Queen f4. Restricting the development of the bishop potentially. Immediately coming with the threats of winning a pawn. And obvious development. Here he didn't think about h4. It would have been fine if he did, but he just castled. That's no problem. And here, connecting the defense of the pawn with the long-term plan of pushing this pawn forward, therefore coming up with the idea of actually retreating the queen to defend the bishop. Taking one step towards pushing this pawn forward. Okay, and then here, he could have played knight d2 right away. He decided to play rook e1 first, which was also interesting because he's concentrating on the side of the board where he's best. And then he plays knight d2, f4 is planned. And then, of course, being aware that this is a paper tiger, he can just push forward with f5. And he's going to open up the king, but also he's aware that this is a queen trap. So really nice play. And then I suppose to finish off, coming in here and just saying, I'm going to simplify everything. Again, not taking forever, playing a very logical move. Man, that's what you need to be, an international master. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this master analysis was, analysis of a master level game was helpful. I think for me it was. And I will be back again for some tactics training and for some training games very shortly. Until then, take care. Thank you for the comments, and we'll see you all soon.